Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Holly Borum, and this book party is sponsored by the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, which is associated with the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. The purpose of our book parties is to celebrate the wonderful work of our fellows, and today we're going to be hearing from Senior Fellow Amy Gore. This is just a reminder to please keep yourself muted until the Q&A. Okay, so Amy is an assistant professor of English at North Dakota State University, where she specializes in early and 19th century American literature, book history, and print culture, and Native American literature. Her first book, which we'll be hearing about today, Book Anatomy, Body Politics, and Materiality in Indigenous Book History, theorizes the material relationships between books and bodies by tracing editions of early Indigenous books across time as embodied expressions of print culture power relations. She is a senior fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, and her articles appear in Studies in American Indian Literature, Pedagogy, and Western American Literature. Amy will be interviewed by Dan. Dan Radis is an associate professor of English at SUNY Cortland, where he specializes in 18th and 19th century Indigenous literatures in North America, with particular interests in Indigenous historical writing, book history, print culture, and materialism. Radis is also a senior fellow in our Society of Fellows, and his scholarship has been supported by fellowships at the American Antiquarian Society and the Newberry Library. His work has been published in American Literature, Studies in American Indian Literatures, Early American Literature, and Criticism. So as for the format today, Dan will lead the conversation with Amy. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat as we go along. In about 40 minutes, Dan will wrap up and I'll start posing your questions to Amy. You're welcome also at that point to come off of mute and ask as well. So with that, over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Holly. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me to take part. I just want to put up Amy's book on the screen. It's a beautiful book with a beautiful cover, and I'm really happy to be able to speak with Amy today about this book. And just to add to Amy's introduction, Amy and I have collaborated in the past and known each other for quite a while, and I just want to add to that introduction. Amy is such a generous, incisive, thoughtful, sensitive scholar. It's been a pleasure to work with her in a bunch of different contexts. So it's a real thrill for me to be able to celebrate this book and the achievement that it represents in our field. So without further ado, then I think we'll just get started with that question that we always begin with, which is tell us a little bit about the book. What are its central claims? What are you trying to tell us? What are its big interventions? Maybe some of its key terms. Let's start there.
Thanks, Dan. That was really kind, and thanks to Catherine and Holly for inviting me as well and for moderating. Yeah, let me also acknowledge with the book cover, I really wanted to support a Native artist, and I was really excited to find this piece of art by Nicholas Galanin, and so check out his work. There's quite a few exhibits. I think he's most famous for the kind of response to the Hollywood sign, the big installation piece that he did called Indian Land. So to talk about the book itself, this book began when I first started my training in book studies, and I began to see bodies everywhere. I was fascinated by the language that was being used, headers and footers and appendix and the spine and a book's face and preface and the language that's used for typeface. So I latched onto that, and that sort of became the basis of this book, an interest in why we are so invested in body language when we talk about the book. And especially when my training before that was in Indigenous studies, and so I was thinking about combining the two, and of course how Indigenous people and people of color have a hyper attention put onto their bodies. And so how those overlapped with this book, thinking about the ways that books are embodied, sometimes forcibly and sometimes as a site of negotiation. So that was one of the main threads that I took up here, is how books become a site of bodies and the negotiation of bodies, of representations, and of power struggles over those representations of bodies. And the way I chose to kind of think through that is to think through some of the early 19th century over into the 20th century authors. So the first known novel published by a Native man, the first known novel and autobiography published by Native women, and how some of those first negotiations of the book into the American literary marketplace became embedded within this language of embodiment. So I'll kind of leave that answer at that. I was just talking before the chat with Dan and Holly about how this book came out in October, and in some ways I'm still kind of intellectually being able to distance myself a little bit from to be able to kind of reflect on this overview of the book and to think through not only this book, but some of the projects beyond. And so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks. I'm kind of interested a little bit later in having you speak more about the origins of the book and kind of opening the veil on process and how you came to the decisions that you made about which books to include in material like this. But maybe just to kind of push a little bit further on the scope of the project and the nature of its intervention, maybe we could kind of frame a bit of this conversation around some of the key terms or concepts that really suffuse the book as a whole. So potentially this idea of books and bodies more generally, but also the book is really invested in paratext. The idea of paratext and what it does for you particularly, but what it kind of like adds to our understanding of Indigenous, not only literary history, but Indigenous book history as well. So you want to speak a little bit about kind of how paratextual elements are central to the claims that you're making?
Yes. So when studying literature that's been marginalized in American literary history, I've thought a lot about, what gets marginalized, what gets overlooked, what gets kind of left out, and kind of sometimes dismissed or sometimes just omitted. And so in looking at the book itself, I became really interested in those parts of the book outside of the text, what gets often overlooked, like, we kind of interact with these elements like the cover and with the preface and with the introduction and footnotes, but they often don't become an object of study, and especially I think not for marginalized literature. Marginalized literature, Indigenous literature included, often becomes invested in culture and politics, which is certainly important, but I think that in including the paratext, in thinking about how, for example, a book's cover, so the cover of Pretty Shield as one example, the way that that book cover, that paratext continues to change throughout the life of the book and negotiates and represents Pretty Shield's body in different ways over the life of the text, became really fascinating to me, and I think really understudied. And so I wanted to bring attention to the way, not only for Pretty Shield and for the text that I pick up, but I think more for Indigenous book studies, to think about how each one of these editions has an extended life. So, for example, in each chapter, I look not only at the first editions and editions published within the author's lifetime, but with editions and reprints, all of the reprints and editions that I could find for the life of the text, all the way up to editions published in 2021 and 2023 for Pretty Shield and for The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta. And I was thinking about, while I was doing that as a methodology, that in being inspired by Lindsay DeCersey's colonial revivals, that each edition and each new reprint of a book calls for an accounting. So in colonial revivals, de Cersei argues for how a reprint of a 19th century text, for example, in the 21st century becomes a 21st century text. And so thinking beyond the individual author and authorial intent, and even thinking about the significance of first editions, extending that through the life of the text, and how these texts, in, I think, even a truer sense than this communication circuit, becomes socially authored, how each text takes up in new ways these negotiations between author and text and author in the literary marketplace. It becomes the book itself and kind of the legacy of the author and the legacy of the story, continuing these negotiations in the 20th century, the late 20th century, and then in our current time. So I wanted to trace that, and I hadn't seen that sort of done before. And I was really fascinated with what I was finding when I was looking at sort of the life of the book. And so I tried to document that here the best I could in this book. And it was fascinating to try to follow it through.
Yeah, I think one of the real achievements of the book is how it brings bibliographical scholarship and book historical research into conversation with a lot of the scholarly preoccupations of Native literary studies, but does so in a way that kind of gives us a new perspective on maybe kind of issues or claims that we have over the course of several decades taken for granted in Native literary studies. So I'm thinking of kind of one example in particular that maybe you could speak a little bit more about, right? So this idea of kind of social authorship, you just said, or kind of networks that collaborate in order to produce books. This is kind of something that is taken as a given in book historical scholarship, bibliographical work. We've, deconstructed that idea of the individual romantic author, but this is something that over the course of several decades has been such a point of contention and a real scholarly focus, particularly of Native American as told to autobiographies, right? The idea of like, how do we place or make sense of the quote unquote authentic authorship of this text? Who's really writing? Who's actually producing this work? How do we negotiate those things? You did some really good work, particularly in the Pretty Shield chapter, but elsewhere as well, talking about that long tradition in Native historical scholarship. But again, the thing that I thought was kind of such a rich intervention into that longer debate is to bring in the book historical or to bring in the bibliographical, right? And to suggest that this is another entry point into that conversation that really hasn't happened before, or hasn't happened in a kind of a structured way in the way that you're doing it. So that's all as preface to suggest maybe you could talk a little bit more about either that narrow particular concern about social authorship, networks of book production, and how it interfaces with some of the questions about as told to autobiography that we've been discussing in Native literary scholarship, or if that is maybe a little too particular, maybe just talk a little bit, or we could do both, talk a little bit about what you see as the affordances of bringing bibliographical study into Native literary history and Native literary scholarship, right? Because I think there's a lot of conversations that still need to be had. We're really at the beginning of this longer, hopefully longer conversation.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the Pretty Shield chapter. So that book I had come across because I I lived in Montana, and I was fortunate enough to work with some Apsalalke people, and that was one of the texts that I encountered in my studies there. And so each one of these texts does have a connection to place for me, by the way. And so Pretty Shield what was and is, I would say, a pretty controversial text. It's an as told to narrative, as you mentioned, Dan, from a woman named Pretty Shield to a white early ethnographer called Frank Linderman. And so the text has been kind of critically debated in some ways in, well, it's, instead of Pretty Shield being able to kind of directly represent her own words, Linderman is mediating her words in her narrative. And so this text, might, some have accused it of like struggling with authenticity. And so it gets into this debate about like whose text does this become. And so I think for book studies and in thinking about the paratext here, especially, I think that that was able to, those kind of studies or methodologies coming from book studies were a way to move beyond the, like, how authentic is this text? Is this even an authentic text? Is this even a native text? And to think about the book itself as a negotiation, as a social authorship, and not to use that argument to take away from Pretty Shield's agency, but to talk about collaboration and negotiation and agency within producing a book. So one of the things that I think the paratext teaches us or helps us pay attention to with that book, and especially over time, over the different editions and reprints of that text, is to think about, well, Linderman actually in the text used direct quotes, and he did from very little kind of editing of the text from what we can see and from what he represents. He also positions himself in place and in community, and he also speaks in Plains Indian Sign Language and represents that in the text. And so for Pretty Shield, he represents her body and the way that she's using her body to tell the story, both through body language and through sign language. And he responds as well with his own sign language and represents that in the text, and then also represents the body of the interpreter as well. And so within the textual content just itself, there's all these bodies being represented and interacting. And then what the paratext helps to kind of contextualize and inform us is who owns copyright, and sort of problematically think through that for the time. I also think through the dedication in the way that Linderman acknowledges kind of this feminist inheritance of the text by dedicating it to his granddaughter, and the ways in which Pretty Shield's descendants as well in later editions start to react to the text, take a more agentive role in producing the text. So for example, Becky Matthews and Alma Snell co-edit a later edition. Alma Snell is one of Pretty Shield's descendants and author an introduction to the text and a preface. And so, and later editions also talk about the ways in which Linderman's descendants and Pretty Shield's descendants have an ongoing relationship that occurred over this book. And so I think this examination of the paratext and this examination of how the different editions and reprints move through time and represent this social authorship allowed me, for example, as a scholar, to help push this conversation from, well, is this an authentic text, to what kind of social negotiations are happening here. And some of those social negotiations, you know, we can certainly critique from a 21st century perspective and from an Indigenous studies perspective, but I think there's other things happening here that should also be taken into account, especially the way in which the text continually returns to community.
Yeah, being in relation, particularly being in good relation, is such a kind of important concern of Indigenous studies scholarship, not only in the work that we do methodologically, but also how it's represented in our objects of study as well. And so I think, I mean, one of the things that this book helps me to think through is how to essentially take that concept that is really central to ethical considerations in Indigenous studies, but also to methods in Indigenous literary studies, how to think of them in a bibliographical way, right? Because we have this language and it comes from both of these spaces, but it's often the case that these spaces aren't talking to one another, even though centrally the concern fundamentally seems the same to me. We're just taking different angles toward that idea. And so again, I really want to stress one of the big interventions that the book makes, and it seems to me to be a real strength of it, is that this is a conversation that's been happening so long in Native literary studies, especially in the eras that you particularly focus the book on. So late 19th century, this is a context in which we get a kind of an outpouring of these mediated texts where we don't exactly know precisely who's authoring them. They are suffused, run through, problematically so, with the kind of advent of ethnography and anthropological discourse. And so it's really hard to make sense in some cases, who's talking and to whom. So bibliographical scholarship really helps us make sense of those things. Focusing on paratext as well helps us make sense of that too. Well, okay, we could go two ways. I could give you an opportunity to kind of speak more generally about some of those affordances from book studies and how you see them playing out in Native literary studies. But I also just wanted to focus a little bit more on paratext, in particular in your chapter about Darcy McNichol and the Surrounded. So one of the wonderful things that you're doing in that chapter is, again, blending Indigenous studies methods with methods that we would more traditionally understand as literary studies. So one of the things that the chapter does really well is focus in on this pervasive thematic and image of perception and of looking in that novel, which is something that, having read your chapter now, seems so obvious in the book, but I've read the book and it wasn't exactly obvious to me upon first reading. So that's kind of an achievement, I think, of the book and a testament to the way that you bring that to the fore. But in any case, what you do really well is you do those kind of close readings, that kind of traditional method of literary studies. You're looking very intensely, very deeply at the text, trying to make sense of how those details matter and how they contribute to meaning. But then you make that jump, right? Which is the thing that the book does and why it's so important, right? You take that jump from Native literary studies, again, to book studies and to bibliography. And you do that by bringing that notion of perception and of looking to an argument about the footnotes in the book, and particularly an argument about how place names are being thought about in footnotes, and about how Darcy McNichol kind of cites his sources in a very particular way in one edition at the beginning of the book and another edition at the end of the book. Do you want to speak a little bit more to like that notion of perception and how it plays with paratext and the Surrounded?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that chapter. That was an exciting one for me because that was also a text that I had been first introduced to in Montana, and so has a special place-based meaning for me. And it's also a text that has been critically debated in Indigenous literary studies. So the novel is about, for those of you who haven't read it, about basically an Indigenous man who comes back to his reservation, and a lot of things tragically go wrong, and the novel kind of ends that way with tragedy, with incarceration, and it's, I think in Indigenous literary studies, people struggle with what to make of such Darcy McNichol himself as such an advocate and an early advocate um, for Indigenous peoples in an academic setting, and then his first novel to be so embedded with kind of this tragedy. And so a lot of the criticism of the novel is about like, well, you know, what does he mean by kind of this tragic ending and kind of the tragedy infused through? Is this like a 20th century thing? And I wanted to kind of literally and figuratively take another look at this text and use book history to do that. And so I think the understated achievements of the text is Darcy McNichol asking us to look at Indigenous peoples in another way, or in a more critical way than what society asks us to do. And I think the way in which he presents the book reinforces the textual content. So what I mean by that is exactly what you said, Dan, with he's using footnotes in a novel, which is super interesting and drew my attention. And also in some of his prefatory material, he dedicates or acknowledges in his book his ethnographic sources. And some of those are by white ethnographers, which is a really interesting dynamic and collaboration. And I think it asks us to look at the whole book rather than just the textual content, but to look at all of the negotiations that are happening, not only within the novel, the text, but with those footnotes, with those citations, even with the cover. The cover frequently features Native people, and some of them, I talk about this, the last edition is a group of Native women, like really direct eye contact on the cover of the latest edition, really kind of pointedly saying, we see you, and we are agentive subjects who are looking back at you, looking at us through this like tourist gaze or through this ethnographic gaze. So I wanted to sort of bring this Indigenous literary studies debate about what to do with this kind of problematic novel, and then this methodology that I was learning from book studies about how to see the whole text and how to make meaning of the whole text, especially through time. And I think that that pays off really productively for the Surrounded in giving us an alternate way to see and understand this, what seems to be on the face, this really tragic text, or really text that doesn't seem to do much for political advocacy, and help us to make sense of it as a holistic and social product.
Yeah, kind of asking us well, essentially asking us to think about the end of this text through a perspectival shift, wherein the reader is kind of forced to encounter this problematic ethnographic gaze, and then maybe potentially to reconsider it, and then how the introduction of those sources at the beginning of the novel or the place names in the footnote kind of reinforces that. I think, yeah, it made really good sense to me how you were bringing together some of these literary studies methods and the book studies concerns as well. Okay, so we have maybe about 12 or 13 minutes left before Q&A. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about where the book came from, right? So the origins of it, not just necessarily in an intellectual sense, but also more broadly, right? You speak to the way in which so many of the chapters have very particular meaning to you through place, but also maybe one way into this question is, was there a particularly challenging chapter to write, a chapter that kind of like confounded you a little bit before you figured out how to put it together? Or maybe another way to ask that is, did you have to kind of travel to really see some of these texts, and was the materiality of a particular text in a particular chapter important, and did you have to go check things out? Were there any sleuthing to be done, or something that you found that you weren't quite expecting that turned into something revelatory?
Yeah, so much there. I really appreciate that question, Dan. And I really love answering questions about process, because I feel like as academics, we often see this product at the end, right? I've been talking a lot about the social product, but the social product begins from an idea and from a conversation. And it doesn't just start at the finished project. And so I like to try to be transparent about my process as an academic in producing this book. I write about it in my acknowledgments. And I think that builds better community when we sort of share our struggles and the sleuthing and, you know, the archival dust, and kind of talk through that together. So this book began as a dissertation, and a very different dissertation at that. My master's thesis was on the Indigenous Gothic, and I entered my PhD program thinking that I was going to continue that work. And the texts that I took up were pretty much the same as you see in this book. But as I continued to think through what the Indigenous Gothic meant, I began, like I started out this conversation, I began to see bodies everywhere. With McNichol, it was eyes. And with Joaquin Murrieta, it was heads. And I remember talking to my dissertation advisor, and I'm like, all these chapters are about bodies, and I keep seeing bodies everywhere. And I feel really uncomfortable with talking about them in these kind of gothic or undead ways. I want to talk about how they live, how they continue to live. And so I changed direction in kind of the framework for how I was talking about these texts. And along the way began to pick up my training in book studies. That same dissertation chair, in one conversation in class, he talked about how people would leave books in trains and how books move. And I became fascinated with that. And so let me just take a sip of water here. I sort of use that spark and that new, excuse me, the new training that I was picking up at the Rare Book School, and change the direction of this text to talk more about this connection between books and bodies and the way that books move. I would say the most challenging chapter that I encountered was also the one, maybe the one I'm most passionate about too, was the second chapter where I talk about Winnemucca and about Callahan. That chapter, I lost count of how many times I revised it. Early iterations, I think were really jumbled. I was struggling with how to talk about the rhetorics of space and how to balance what I wanted to say with these two authors. And even after peer review of the manuscript, it went through really another major overhaul between getting peer reviews back from on my manuscript to the final product. Really went a kind of complete overhaul. And so that the version in the final product of this book, in some ways went through peer review, and in some ways this like kind of more recent overhaul did not. And so that was a really interesting way in which to become a first author for me was like, wow, okay, I'm making these big revisions, and there's not sort of a you know, kind of a final like check to make sure I really, you know, didn't mess anything up, or you know, kind of the ways in which, and my lesson for myself with that is like the way in which there's a product and it's never finished. And I think that also speaks to the book itself. And one of the lessons I took from my own research and in the way I look at these books is the books continue to live on. And for me, my own book kind of continues to live on in the ways that I would think about revising it, or thinking about you know, stuff that I left out. I actually cut out the first chapter of the dissertation. It does not appear in the book. And so for me, I often kind of mess up the numbers. For me, Joaquin Murrieta is chapter number 2 because there's this ghost of a chapter that didn't appear in the book. And so I guess that'll just be a little bit about the process for me. And I'll speak, I guess, to the conclusion. Dan and I were talking before over email about this interview. And the conclusion for me is the one in which I feel like I take the most risks. It had some reviewers really like the conclusion, and some, I think, rightfully raised a lot of questions about it. And so the conclusion in which I talk about kind of digital editions and the future of materiality, and problematize or express some of my issues with digitization, feels risky for me. So we'll see what happens with the reviews and the way that this book continues to circulate and become a social product again.
Yeah, I would love for you just in our last couple of minutes to talk a little bit more about the claim in that conclusion, because it is quite risky. I don't know if risky is the word, but it strikes against, I think, so much of the conversation around preservation that we're having now, right? Essentially, the argument of the chapter is like print matters, which is maybe for this audience obvious, right? But in a broader sense, maybe is a claim that really needs to be defended. But it's not just that print matters or the materiality matters, not to say that there isn't materiality in the digital, but there's a different type of materiality in the physical in this respect, trying to draw that distinction. But it particularly matters in an Indigenous book historical and an Indigenous literature context. You want to say a little bit more about how you were framing that and thinking about it?
Sure. So that last chapter was inspired not only by a book, but by academic conversation. So one of the ways in which I'm thinking about citing these days with my scholarship is to make sure that I include academic conferences and academic conversations as well as print-based texts that I'm citing. And so I was really inspired by an MLA panel with Andrew Stauffer and others in which he talked about material loss in libraries, especially for the late 19th and early 20th century, and how past and sometimes present archival practices, library practices that are, subject to outside pressures, not just standards of the field for librarianship, are encountering tremendous loss. And so my conclusion talks about the materiality of print and why it matters, why keeping different editions of a book, different copies of a book matter, and that digitized editions and copies are not substitutes. So what I often encountered with trying to do research for this book was sometimes encountering a digitized edition of a book and then realizing this was especially true for Joaquin Murrieta, is that it was mislabeled. It was, an 1873 edition instead of 1871. And often these digitized editions, one kind of digitized version was considered good enough. And I think this especially happens for marginalized writers. I might even say for Indigenous writers, in that, well, if there's one kind of copy of the book that's digitized, that's great access, and that's kind of good enough, and that represents the text. So what I argue for in my conclusion is why there's such an urgent, pressing, crucial need for all of these copies, for all of these editions, and to look at the life of the book and all copies that we can get our hands on. And again, just to cite Lindsay DeCersey's Colonial Arrivals, we foreshorten our understanding of a text when we just look at a first edition, or when we just look at even just one edition, even if that's a scholarly edition. I think that we're missing out on the life of this text and the way it's interacted with community when we have kind of one supposedly substitutive digital edition.
And that, I understand that the conclusion is kind of future looking and kind of prospecting outward and making a claim for how to approach things in the years to come. But I think one of the strongest arguments for the claim that you're making in that conclusion is an argument that you start to elucidate in the first chapter on Murrieta, right? The idea that the first edition of that text was, it's very rare, and there was a history of scholarship around that text that was built up essentially without the first edition of that text being known. And it really changed our understanding of essentially whose text that was and how it was being distributed when that new edition, quote unquote, new edition popped up. So maybe, do you want to speak just a little bit to how you see maybe that forward-looking claim in the conclusion kind of really being very impactful in the first chapter?
Yeah, for me, Indigenous book history and Indigenous literary studies generally is such an exciting field because there's still so much recovery work going on. And so you're exactly right. In that first chapter with Murrieta, there's only one known edition, one known copy left of the first edition. And that, although I've since learned, I think there's another copy in private hands, but I haven't been able to confirm that. So maybe 2 copies left in the world of the first known novel published by a Native man. And so that becomes problematic for book methodology, right? It's harder to look at copy and states and issues. It's also hard for the scholarship. So 20th century, around 1920s, 1930s scholarship threw a lot of shade at who wrote this book because there wasn't a first edition to work from. There were a lot of kind of dubious or plagiarized editions that were out there. And so there was a lot of discrediting of Ridge as the author of that book. When the first edition did come to light, it in some ways changed things in that we are able to do more arguments around authorship and agency, but there's still a lot of work to be done with kind of arguing for Indigenous authors and agency, even to connect this conversation to the Pretty Shield chapter with As Told To narratives. There wasn't as much question about if this was Pretty Shield's work, but there were questions about whether they were Pretty Shield's words. So I guess all that to say, there is still so much controversy surrounding Indigenous people as authors and as writers that the materiality of Indigenous books and the way that we can see editions kind of move through time and encounter not only the negotiations of like publisher and copyright and print, but also the scholarship itself was something that I hope that this kind of book kind of foregrounds in the future work that we do as Indigenous studies scholars.
Yeah, that's great, Amy. I'm going to turn it over to Holly. I think we're right on time for a Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. And yes, it is now time for Q&A. And so I see some clapping hands and I see some nice comments in the chat already for people who've appreciated your talk. So thank you so much. Let's see. I will just open this up and say you're welcome to put questions into the chat, or also just to raise your hand, and you could turn on your video or not. That's up to you, and ask your question out loud. As an outsider to the field, Amy, I guess one of my questions for you is even just where are, if there's only one book, where is it? Or what libraries or archives, how are the repositories that you visited for your project?
Sure. So I, some of these books I was just able to purchase outright. So not first editions, luckily enough, when I was at the University of New Mexico, while this project was a dissertation, I was able to look at a first edition in the holdings right at the University of New Mexico. I was also able to look at sort of I'm going to call it a brother text, I guess, of Pleniku. I call it a brother text because it was also as told to by Linderman from another Crow person. So Pleniku. So Linderman collected 2 autobiographies from Pretty Shield. So I mentioned both of these because they both have thumbprints in the text, which was really kind of my most immediate way of saying like the body in the text, like here's a thumbprint in the book that continues to be reproduced across all these reprints and editions. So University of New Mexico thankfully had some great holdings. And then the rest of the Pretty Shield editions and reprints that I looked at, I was able to purchase. I was able to go to Manhattan, Kansas, to the archive there at Kansas State after the pandemic. That I had a lot of trouble, of course, with the manuscript, book manuscript version kind of occurred during the pandemic, and there was a lot of materials I wasn't able to look at due to travel. But shortly after the pandemic, when it was safe enough to travel, I drove down to Manhattan and was fortunate enough to look at one of the only second editions that is available of Callahan's Wynema. The only known kind of public-facing edition of Joaquin Murrieta is at the Beinecke. And there's only, to my knowledge, only two copies of the first novel ever printed by a Native woman. So that's S. Alice Callahan's Wynema, and that's at Oklahoma State Historical Society and Ohio State University. So yeah, these kind of the rarity of these books also speaks to materiality and archival preservation of Indigenous authors, and kind of the unequal ways in which Indigenous materials get preserved and represented and have access.
Thank you for that answer. Let's see, Glenda has a question for us here. She says, I love what you said about citing conversations and conferences. Could you tell us more about whether non-academic or para-academic conversations also influenced your thinking in this work?
Yeah, I perhaps took too much time in writing my acknowledgements, but I loved the craft of writing an acknowledgement for a book. And for me, that was a way to cite those non-academic and para-academic conversations and influences and just support. As a person, as a writer, as an academic, I'm a first-generation scholar, first-generation college student. And so I wanted to acknowledge the multiple different kinds of support I received and was influenced by for this book. And so I was able to cite a lot of that, conferences I attended, conferences, conversations, meals, just conversations in the hallways at conferences that helped me kind of navigate how to get a book published. I'm thinking of Christina Stanchu here, who had a hoarse voice, like I just encountered a little bit in my book talk here. So she was hoarse, she was sick, and pulled me aside, nevertheless, at a conference to say, how are you kind of navigating your book contract? And here's some advice, and contact me if you need anything. And so just those really kind, generous conversations that happen and that are part of the book, part of the social production of a book. I also cite, my dogs, my family, the places where I worked, a lot of, I guess, the power to keep going in writing this book and kind of slogging through kind of the reading that strained my eyes during the dissertation. I know that we can all kind of relate to that. I really appreciated when I was living in New Mexico, just being able to just sit out in the sun and kind of soak up that vitamin D that kind of helped me keep going in some tough times. And so I really think it's important for us to cite community. And I appreciate that question, Glenda.
Okay, well, looks like Cap Devil has put in a couple comments here. One about the problem of using the term book history, and then also citing a conference in Leiden last summer, since we're speaking of conferences, Empire, Indigeneity, and Colonial Heritage Collections, Confronting Difficult Pasts and Enabling Just Futures. And the conference videos are online. This occurred in August of 2023. So I'm sure you've have lots of thoughts about the concept of book history, Amy, and whether the pros and cons of using those terms. I don't know if you want to reflect on any of the, and I think you did already in some of the questions with Dan about traditional notions of book history and how how your books or texts have fit into that. I don't know if you want to say anything broader about those kinds of questions too.
Yeah, I guess just one kind of quick comment is that I do really appreciate the term book studies, and I would love to see us move towards using that phrase as a field. I think that encapsulates the interdisciplinarity of what we do a little bit better than book history does, and I'm starting to try to interchange and try to lean more towards the latter phrase myself. So I haven't read your blog, but I appreciate that comment.
Yeah, that is interesting, right? Because that encompasses the contemporary project of making books or all aspects instead of, I think book history, right, implies it's something in the past and that there's one kind of history, right? And that's a good, I like that. I think I'll adopt that too, Amy. Thank you. Book studies. All right. Unless we have any further questions, I will wrap us up here and say thank you so much. I want to just let everybody know, well, thank you first of all to Amy and Dan, and thank you for presenting this material that is fascinating and makes us think about books and book studies in new ways. I want to just say that our last book party of the academic year is going to be April 17th. Author Jenny Grillo is going to be in conversation with Paul Dilley on her book, Daniel After Babylon, Editions in the History of Interpretation. Thank you again, everybody, for participating today, and take care and goodbye.
Thank you very much to Catherine and to Holly and to Dan and to all attendees.